It's Thursday, March 7th, and this is the 1909, State News' weekly podcast featuring our reporters talking about the news. I'm your host, Alex Walters. This week, an outside investigation has once again thrust MSU's Board of Trustees into tumult and turmoil. Two members are accused of wide-ranging misconduct, including repeated interference in university affairs and attempts to orchestrate attacks on their political rivals through manipulation of students. The investigation recommends that they be removed from office. Now, to break all this down, what the board members did, what it means for MSU, what might happen next, I'm joined by the State News' administration reporters, Theo, Scheer, and Owen McCarthy.
Thanks for having us.
Owen, great to have both of you guys back on the show.
Thank you, Alex.
Always great. So MSU is getting back from spring break this week. You guys didn't exactly get one because midway through the week we got this report, and you have been working hard all week down in the salt mine doing the news,
That's right.
And you're here to talk about it, and it's a lot, And before we get into all of that lot that went on last week, let's go back to October, to when all of this stuff starts. For those listening to the 1909 who are so confused right now. All right, October, MSU board. Theo, how did this whole thing get started?
The letter that started it all, right?
Yeah.
So this happened when Trustee Brianna Scott, she wrote a letter to the board, and we published this letter, basically calling out the board chair at the time, Brima Vassar, for allegedly, violating a lot of board policies, overstepping in her role as trustee. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a few specific allegations, right, that she's bullying the interim president, Teresa Woodruff. She meddled in this official report about the campus shooting, settling all these lawsuits, leaking the name of the woman that Mel Tucker sexually harassed, Brenda Tracy. Just all of these things, and it kind of caused an uproar, and you would see a lot of different, sides being chosen, and eventually MSU took these allegations so seriously that they started an investigation just to see whether they're true.
They hired, an outside firm.
To
say there's all this stuff being alleged. Let's see what of it is true, what isn't. And so these lawyers have, for months now, been working on this investigation. And talk about the scope of this investigation. Who they talked to, how much does it cost?
Yeah, so it's obviously they started with this specific list of allegations that Scott put out, but it kind of expanded as it went further. I mean, the investigators say that Vassar, during the investigation, also put out her own letter of allegations to investigators, and they expanded it to include some of those. As they were going about this, we actually released a story on the naming the two finalists for the presidential search. Mm-hmm. They expanded it to include how that information got out to the public.
Yeah.
And just a number of, I think it was 50 allegations all told.
Because the mandate was pretty broad. Obviously it started with this letter, but then what was actually asked of these lawyers was investigate basically any violations of the trustee code of conduct. So I think it kind of expanded and expanded. And do you have the numbers in total, how many people they interviewed, the gigabytes of documents, all that?
It was, I think it was over 50 people they interviewed. I know that. And it was, God, do you have that, Owen?
I'm searching for it right now. It was definitely over 50. And then I think they also had the number, I think it was also over 50 separate allegations as well. So yeah, they definitely, as time went on, and more people brought more things to light. There were even some people who were interviewed and kept anonymous, who also just raised some separate concerns about interactions they were having with trustees, where they even were looking into some of those things. So yeah, when it was all said and done, it was over 50 allegations separately that were looked into.
It was really an opportunity for people to sort of air out their grievances, within the board and about the board.
Yeah, and it seemed like they did because there's all this new stuff in this report. Yeah. Before we get into some of that new stuff that's been turned up by this report, talk me through the things in Scott's letter that she alleged back in October. Which of them were corroborated, and which of them were they not able to find evidence?
Yeah, so a big part of her letter was allegation that Vassar is bullying Woodruff, that she's requesting her speaking schedule
the interim
for
president.
Things. Yes, the interim president. They found that there is this sort of fraught relationship between the two of them, and they provided a few sort of vague examples of that. However, in the end, it didn't violate board policies. It didn't cross that line of, I believe, deceit, incivility, etc. Mm-hmm. I think the next one that was pretty big was the official report about the February campus shooting. There's just this big review of how MSU responded, etc., Scott alleged that Vassar kind of bullied, or not, I guess that wasn't the wording that she used, but convinced the investigators to change a finding in that review and kind of soften the wording to be a little bit nicer on the trustees.
Because the finding initially, was saying that these trustees were acting outside of their role in a harmful way and sort of interfering in their response to the shooting. But obviously the one that eventually was released was sort of a much softer wording. I forget exactly what it was. But along the lines of trustees desperately wanted to help and, did a little bit too much.
Yeah, they initially reported that desperately wanted to help, became involved in the incident beyond their expertise and outside their appropriate role. So pretty firm, right? But what was actually published in the end, it just said that they wanted to help but became involved in the incident beyond the customary role and expectations of a governance board.
Yeah.
So Scott was saying that Vassar was the one who kind of pushed them to change that wording.
Yeah.
What they found instead, that it wasn't Vassar, that instead people that were in on that meeting say it was actually Deno.
Trustee Dennis Deno.
Trustee Dennis Deno, who is really a big part of this report as well, who kind of led this questioning of the consultants of that firm. And
Can you talk through it too? Because we've talked so much for months now about all this change in the report, the official shooting report. We've never actually known what the conduct was that the trustees did that was, described as so inappropriate. Now we do. Mm-hmm. Talk us through, what did these trustees do that all of this stir has been made about?
Yeah. I think a big part of it, they said that trustees showed up at Sparrow Hospital to try and visit the survivors, and kind of inserted themselves between phone calls between the administration and grieving families, kind of again out of this desire to help, but in effect it kind of interfered in this established process that they have at the hospital.
Well, didn't the hospital contact MSU? And
yeah, they did. They were.
They basically requested that in the future, MSU, they don't show up to the hospital, or was it that they needed to notify them first? I think it was just that can't happen again. When it comes to official MSU visits, that can't happen.
Yeah, trustees can't be showing up in hospital rooms.
Right. So, but apparently Deno really took objection to that finding, right? And sort of led this questioning of the investigators, really saying, is that really appropriate, in a way that other trustees present at the meeting described as bullying and aggressive. And eventually they did sort of change these things, and in the final report we see a very softer approach on the trustees.
And that sort of, aggressive intimidation from Deno is something that's repeated with a lot of examples in this report, including even the lawyers who compiled the report say that in their interview with Deno, he threatened them. And then they write this thing about we're not influenced by his behavior and whatnot. But they try to make a point there with they're saying this is so widespread, even we got some of it. But anyway, go on. Scott letter. What's true? What's not?
Yeah. All right. So that one's the. The lawsuit over Gupta. So the former MSU business dean, right? This is the whole saga. Was fired or ousted for not reporting this Title IX violation. Scott said that Vassar tried to single-handedly settle a lawsuit related to that.
Because he ends up, this dean sues the university and says I shouldn't have been fired for not reporting that sexual misconduct. He actually alleges that it's part of this presidential succession scheme by which they're trying to force him out. But anyway, Scott alleges that Vassar tried to make that go away and put together a settlement for the dean.
A pretty big thing. And the report actually did corroborate that allegation. They said that she did act without the proper authority to do that, to settle it.
And what about because another huge part of Scott's letter was this allegation that Vassar had accepted gifts from MSU donors, these private jet flights to and from March Madness basketball games, which, of course, that allegation ends up putting MSU's accreditation in jeopardy, because part of the accreditation is that, the board is supposed to be free from undue influence from donors. What do the consultants make of that allegation?
Yeah, well, that one's, you kind of went into that, really.
Yeah, so it did ultimately corroborate that it was inappropriate and it was violating, conflict of interest rules that the board has. In sort of, it was there was two separate basketball games that Vassar accepted courtside seats for, and that was, the board has a process where they can request tickets for these games, but they're not courtside, and they would be like grouped in with other MSU people, right?
Yeah.
And so it's all like on the books. But Vassar had these two separate occasions where she accepted tickets to these courtside games, and then also there was two separate private jet flights that Scott initially said were inappropriate. Only one of them was ultimately determined to be truly inappropriate, but it was with this donor who, what really makes it complicated is that specific donor was in ongoing negotiations with the university and Vassar at the time related to an NIL deal, which I think we'll talk about a little bit more.
Let's talk about that right now. Let's get into it. So this
it.
is, Steve St. Andre. He's a, prominent. He's a billionaire. He's a big MSU grad, MSU donor, and he's, taking her on this private jet to the games. But at the same time, he has this NIL collective, which is this. It's sort of a complicated thing. It's where fans are paying into this collective, then the money goes to the player. It's a very indirect way to basically pay college athletes.
Right.
But anyway, he's trying to get MSU's trademark rights to start this, and he's selling this merch. I think Spartan Dogs for Life is the brand. What does the report say about Vassar's involvement in that?
Yeah, it really says that she kind of interfered with negotiations between this donor and the universities, that she kind of inappropriately put herself into that and encouraged them to accept the deal.
Because it seemed from the report, MSU's general counsel, trademark office didn't want to do this deal with the donor to give them the trademark rights, but I think her wording was, we have to get to yes, and we have to find a way to give him these rights so he can sell this merchandise. Anyway, and then what about also in Scott's letter is these allegations about, if you remember back in April, there's this whole mess with the MSU board where the Attorney General sends a letter saying, you got to release these now kind of infamous, the Nassar docs as they're known. It's these documents MSU has withheld for years relating to the university's handling of Larry Nassar. And it looks like the board's going to release them. At the last minute, they don't. The Attorney General says that, Vassar went to her and said, we're going to do it, and then backed out at the last minute and didn't do it. Scott alleges that Vassar tried to orchestrate this whole thing and wasn't able to. And, it's all been a very public mess that we've observed. What do these lawyers who investigated it say really happened?
Yeah, she said that basically, Vassar claims that she had the consensus of all these trustees before going to the Attorney General, that it was supposed to be expected, et cetera. But the report found that that's not true, that the trustees weren't expecting this, that she kind of did this on her own, independently, that she, unilaterally intervened in discussions about this, which did violate board policies. Yeah.
All right. So we've talked about, what's the Scott letter, true, untrue, all that. But talk me through, I think the most fascinating part of this report, the part that's been discussed the most, is these completely new allegations, or not really allegations, this proven actions that were done after the release of the Scott letter, in the aftermath of that, to create this sort of retaliation campaign with these student groups. Yeah. Talk me through everything that went on there.
Yeah, it's really, it's intense. They found that they are using student groups to orchestrate these attacks on colleagues that
sort of political rivals.
That they don't like. Yeah, exactly. And there are two examples of that very thing. The first one is encouraging a student to write a letter to the Higher Learning Commission that kind of denounces, in a way, another rival of Vassar and Denos, the faculty senate chair, Jack Lipton. Yeah. Right. So basically, this letter kind of talks about this, Black student experience at MSU, and specifically talks about how Jack Lipton at a board meeting called student supporters of Vassar a mob, described them as a mob. And talking about how that language is sort of derogatory in different ways and plays into these stereotypes, et cetera. The report found that Vassar encouraged that student to write the letter. The Vassar and Deno kind of played into that a little bit. But as Owen found out, the person who actually wrote that letter says the report is wrong.
She's denied it, right? She said, no, I did that of my own volition. It's not because of what Vassar and Deno said.
Exactly, yeah. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I talked with the author of that letter. Her name is Missy Chola. She's a Black student leader here at MSU. And she told me that she did that. In fact, she said she feels insulted by the implication that someone had to tell her to do that, because she said she was genuinely was concerned by the language that Lipton had used and thought that it was, endangering to Black and brown students on campus, and that she did that completely independently. And so she contested like some of the evidence that the report uses as well to prove it. I don't know how much we want to get into the weeds, but there was a text that was used, an anonymous source in the report had some text messages where the author, Missy Chola, she told me that, I wrote that text. She wrote, Dr. Vassar is quite pissed too.
About the Higher Learning Commission not investigating it.
Exactly.
Right?
Right.
Yeah, they chose not to investigate.
Right. And so she says that, and then the reporters use that basically to say, look, that means she was pushing for this report and telling these students. But then, Missy Chola told me that, no, it's just that I reached out to Vassar after hearing that there wasn't going to be an investigation, and I wanted to talk about next steps for what we can do. And Vassar responded to her and said, I think it's unfortunate that the HLC isn't taking these allegations more specifically, but nothing about that, from what Missy Chola said, nothing about that was her saying that she, was behind it from the start, was behind the complaint from the start.
Yeah. And then, outside of that specific, the HLC example, right?
Yeah.
There's sort of this broader, and it's kind of incredible what's in this report, because, Vassar and Deno have this meeting with all these student leaders, specifically from a lot of Black campus groups, and also leaders in sort of the Palestinian campus groups, and the solidarity with Palestine, that kind of thing. And the meeting was recorded secretly, and the investigators get a hold of that from a source.
Yeah.
And so they have this tape of Vassar and Deno talking to the students.
Mm-hmm.
What did Vassar and Deno say to these students? What went on in this meeting that was secretly recorded?
Yeah. So basically, in this conversation, the pretext of the or the pretense of the meeting was, and this is what the report said, was that these students were going to meet with Vassar and Deno as a preview of a meeting they were going to have with Woodruff to talk about their concerns. So it was almost like Vassar and Deno were like, we're going to sit down with you and like tell you what your strategy should be with how you deal with the administration.
Woodruff, the interim president.
Exactly. And so ultimately what the recordings turned up, though, is that, Vassar and Deno were specifically saying to try to embarrass the administration, embarrass Woodruff. There was this whole campaign, hashtag not a Spartan. And Deno even volunteered to, pay for T-shirts, but keep my name out of it, right?
Yeah. Don't they say crucify the interim president? Is that their language? Yeah.
Very pointed language. Yeah.
And then also specifically to publicly smear Jack Lipton, who is the chair of the Faculty Senate, who we mentioned earlier, publicly smear him as a racist, playing off of his comments, the mob comment specific. It's important to note Lipton has apologized for those comments and said that when he made the mob comment, what he was trying to say was there was a lot of chaos at this board meeting, and the leadership of the board, who would have been Vassar, had the power to kind of, with, I don't know if they have an actual gavel, but basically it's her authority to rein everything in and call order.
Yeah. And
so he's saying that's why he made that statement, and has said that he needs to be more careful with his language. So basically Deno said, the other thing you can do to help me out is call Lipton a racist. And then he ultimately gives the name of a Detroit News reporter who had published the mob statement, gives the name and email to a student that he was meeting with here, and says to reach out to them. And that student asks, what should I say? And Deno replies, Lipton equals racist. So it was kind of just this section of the report was definitely, I think, kind of jarring to a lot of people, in just the sense that these colleagues were really trying to, or these Vassar and Deno were really trying to get these students to go after, people that Vassar and Deno work with, people in the administration.
Yeah, and because this is interesting, because these student groups have publicly in the past been very supportive of Vassar and Deno amidst the first allegations in October and everything that's followed. But now, members of these student groups are turning over secret recordings to investigators and showing them the text and talking about this. You talked to the student who recorded the meeting, who talked to the investigators about all this, and you got her perspective on, what is it that changed that, changed their outlook. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, so the person is referred to as interviewee 10 in the report, and their name is Saba Saeed, sort of a prominent Palestinian student activist here on our campus. She's been very vocal about like divestment issues and just generally supporting Arab students with the ongoing violence in Gaza this semester. And so basically, she told me, I interviewed her, she told me she's really been working with Vassar and Deno and just the school in general going back for a while to try to bring some of these concerns. But kind of what started to happen is that Saba Saeed gradually started to grow a little bit suspicious. She told me she was like suspicious from the start just because she's dealing with people who are in a position of power, but those suspicions started to mount. And she basically said, they seemed to really kind of say one thing and then the actions wouldn't back it up. So they would seem to really say like, we support you guys, but she started noticing that they were most enthusiastic about their conversations when they centered around smearing one of their opponents, namely the Lipton conversation that comes up in the report. So Saba said, in that conversation was November 1st, Saba said on winter break, she had a lot of time to kind of reflect, and she started to realize that a lot of her anger about this whole situation was really being directed at certain certain individuals, like Woodruff and like Lipton. And Saba said she even met with Lipton and realized and had a really productive conversation and realized that Saba said she hadn't even read the article, the Detroit News article, and was really just going off of what Vassar and Deno were saying, is that this guy's racist. So Saba sort of, said she had some time to reflect and then decided she was going to reach out to the investigators and share her concerns.
Well, and there's this great quote in the article, too, where, because you ask Saba, you say, well, why were you, recording these meetings with them? And she says, well, she had these suspicions. And she says, this is her quote, if I wasn't sussed out about them, I wouldn't have recorded meetings. How could you be talking so much crap about the people you work with?
Exactly.
And so she has these recordings that become sort of like, the nail in the coffin for Vassar and Deno. Exactly. The investigators, conclude, like, this is not appropriate behavior of trustees. And so let's talk about that, the investigators' conclusions. They've, turned up all of, this, corroboration of some Scott's allegations, these wholly new, this wholly new information about these other, kind of forms of misconduct that have been going on. What do they say should be done about these two trustees?
Yeah, I mean, so for Vassar and Deno, they say that it should be reviewed to the governor under a Michigan law. So under the Michigan Constitution, the governor has the right to remove any publicly elected official, and that includes, members of university governing boards. They say under this law, the governor needs to make a decision. So basically they're saying, the governor needs to decide whether to remove Vassar and Deno from the positions altogether. In addition to that, they found that Scott, who originally wrote the letter that started it all, she should be censured for releasing sort of confidential information.
I think the talk of, some of these settlement discussions violates attorney-client privilege, they said, and so.
Exactly.
And so anyway, so then the board announces after they get their hands on this report that they're going to have a meeting to consider these recommendations. Are we going to censure Scott? Are we going to, vote to, ask the governor to remove these two trustees? But before that meeting happens, something changes.
Right. This is huge. Vassar resigns as board chair. She's still a trustee. She's still on the board, but she's no longer board chair.
And talk me through, because she said publicly, I think she talked to the Detroit News about what motivated that decision.
Yeah. Well, she says, she's broken no law. They tried to silence me in all sorts of ways. They tried to frame me. That's what she told the Detroit News. So I decided to be fiscally responsible and step down from the chair position. I have another life to live outside the university, and frankly, MSU doesn't need this. So it's a very strong statement.
But then actually at the meeting, she says even more, and she says that she thought resigning would cool the temperature of the board.
Right.
And though she says that she doesn't think that it actually has, but I guess maybe like resigning as a way to kind of keep her board seat, but just not her chair seat. But obviously, spoiler alert, it's not how it goes.
Right.
Let me unspoiler that. I don't know if that's right. Talk about what happens at the meeting.
Right. So the special meeting, we should know, it's 10 p.m. on a Sunday night.
You two are up late.
We're past our bedtimes, and
we got school the next day.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So they decide to basically follow the report's findings, recommend them to Governor Whitmer for removal, but also strip them of their duties. So, Chair Vassar, was on the Henry Ford Steering Committee, I believe.
Like this partnership between Henry Ford Hospital and MSU. She was on that board. But
So
there's
she
also the
stripped
committees,
that.
right, where
Yeah,
the board
these-
kind of does its actual work in these. And so they're off the committees.
Yeah.
Which is
for Deno, it's Student Affairs, I believe.
Academic.
for
Academic Affairs. There it is.
But so it's interesting because like the board doesn't have the power to remove a trustee. They can't say that they're not trustees anymore. But at that meeting, they did vote to strip them of all the duties and powers of trustees.
Yeah.
And it's still unclear. I saw an MSU spokesperson just today was telling LSJ, like, they don't even really know 100% what that means.
Mm-hmm.
The board is still figuring it out. But on paper, Deno and Vassar, they are trustees, but they can't do anything a trustee can do.
Right.
It's unclear what that actually will look like in practice, but that's what the board voted on. And they voted 6-2, right? Vassar and Deno are against that decision. Everyone else is on board.
Exactly.
And Scott's censure, that passed as well, right?
That
but
passed as well. Vassar voted no.
Scott votes yes for her
Scott
own
votes
censure.
yes for her, yeah. Yep.
She accepts it. Did Vassar explain the no vote?
She did not, no.
Interesting.
Even though, before she released a statement saying that she agreed that Scott should be censured, but I guess she changed her mind at some point.
Yeah. But anyway, so now that's where we're at.
Right.
We're waiting for the governor. It's Tuesday. We're recording the 1909.
Mm-hmm.
If this comes out on Thursday, the governor's already done something. I don't know. We're going to have to scrap the whole. It's going to be such a lame podcast.
Yeah.
It'll be like a time capsule to this moment in MSU history.
Sure.
Nice.
Before that thing happened. But anyway, so we're waiting on the governor. But also, as all of this is going on, starting yesterday morning, we've got a new president. He started.
Yep.
He is MSU's 22nd president, Kevin Guskowitz. He is starting the job. I imagine that's complicated to start as president after reading this report about how the board tried to encourage students to crucify your predecessor.
Right.
What has he said about, what does he make of all this? Is he okay?
Yeah, I think he wrote a community letter, sent it to all the students, and basically said that he's excited to start, and obviously he's got all these initiatives, but the results of the report, he said, were concerning, I believe. I think that was the wording there. He didn't say much more, but he emphasized this whole idea of finding a true north for everybody to follow in the trustee circle, and kind of leading MSU out of this history of
interference.
Controversy.
And that's something that was discussed a lot during the search for him as president. We have those documents. You remember when, the faculty, as they were searching for the next president, asked the candidates, what are you going to do? How are you going to deal with this board? And he writes that he will only take the job if the board promises not to interfere in his work. Yeah. And then when they appoint him, they sign these pledges, basically, and they pass them as a resolution at a meeting that say, we will not interfere in Kevin Guskowitz's work as president, his administration. So it seems, on paper at least, and in their sort of hopeful view of what's to come, it might look a little bit different.
Right.
Who knows if that'll happen?
Who knows?
But you guys will be covering it, as you do with this stuff. Great to have both of you on the show, as always. You guys are so knowledgeable about this stuff. It's awesome to be able to kind of break it down more conversationally. I'm excited to have you on again when something else happens.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Well, that's all for this week. We will be back next week with fresh reporting from the great minds here at the State News. Until then, the stories we discussed and a bunch more are available at statenews.com. Thank you to my guests, Theo and Owen, our podcast editor, Anthony Brinson, our video producer, Brad LaPlante, and most of all, thank you for listening. For the 1909, I'm Alex Walters.